The London sky did not just burn, it hemorrhaged, turning the colour of necrotic tissue as the dimensional membrane ruptured above the Thames in a silent scream of physics being violated. The Zeppelin armada of the Millennium Organization blocked the moonlight, but the tear in reality was brighter than the fires below, a jagged wound in the fabric of space-time that screamed with a frequency only bats and monsters could hear. Michael Morbius did not step through a portal. He was ejected like a foreign pathogen being purged by a cosmic immune system. He struck the cobblestones of a burning alleyway in Southwark with enough force to shatter his tibia, the bone snapping with a wet crunch that was immediately swallowed by the cacophony of the blitz. Pain was nothing new to him, but this air tasted wrong. It tasted of sulphur and ancient dust, thick, with a psychic weight that pressed against his enhanced senses like a physical hand. In his universe, vampirism was a disease, a glitch in the genetic code derived from bat DNA and desperate science. Here, as he gasped for breath amidst the smoke, the very atmosphere felt saturated with something archaic and sentient. He was a man of science drowning in a world of magic, and his cellular biology began to riot. The hunger hit him instantly, not the usual creeping thirst, but a violent starving demand amplified by the ambient energy of 1,000,000 dying souls. He tried to stand his healing factor, already knitting the bone back together with agonizing speed, hot steam rising from his pale skin. Shadows moved at the end of the alley. They were not human. They wore uniforms that should have been dust decades ago, marching with the stiff, unnatural gait of reanimated corpses. These were not the vampires he knew, not the tragic accidents of science, or the Gothic romanticisms of literature. They were meat puppets animated by a force he could not quantify under a microscope. 3 soldiers of the Millennium Organization turned their eyes glowing with a flat, artificial red light. They raised their MP-40 submachine guns, identifying the pale, gaunt figure before them, not as an ally but as unknown biomass. Morbius bared his teeth, the fangs extending not through magic, but through shifting cartilage and muscle. His radar sense pinged the environment, mapping the hollow cavities of their chests and the stagnant, rotten fluid pumping through their veins. They were dead things pretending to be alive. He was a living thing cursed to consume life. The distinction was academic, but the violence that followed was absolute. When the first soldier fired, Morbius moved faster than the bullets, a blur of monochromatic lab coat and claws. He did not turn into mist or summon bats. He moved with the terrifying kinetic energy of a biological predator. He tackled the lead soldier, his claws shredding the Nazi uniform and the grey dead flesh beneath. There was no blood spray, only a puff of dust and dry decay. Morbius recoiled, spitting out a mouthful of ash. He had expected hemoglobin, platelets, plasma. He got dust. The hunger screamed in protest. These creatures were empty calories. He was starving in a buffet of ghosts. The other 2 soldiers opened fire, the bullets tearing through his shoulders and flank. He roared a sound that was less human and more chiropteran, a sonic blast that shattered the glass in the windows above them. He lunged again, desperation overriding tact. He needed fresh blood. He needed a living host. The chaotic noise of the city masked his arrival from the general populace, but it did not hide him from the apex predators of this ecosystem. High above the slaughter on the command deck of the Deus Ex Machina, the Major paused in his conducting of the war. The monitors displayed the massacre of Londoners, but his single organic eye twitched. The sensors of the airship, designed to track necromantic energy, spiked with an unknown variable. It was not the holy power of Iscariot, nor the dark familiarity of Alucard. It was a biological anomaly, a heat signature that burned with the fever of a virus rather than the coldness of the grave. Simultaneously, miles away amidst the ruins of the Hellsing Manor, where Integra Fairbrook Wingates stood, defiant against the tide of darkness, Alucard paused. The no-life king halted his laughter, his shadow writhing independently of the fires. He smelled it, a scent that made no sense. It smelled like blood, but it smelled sterile. It smelled like a laboratory trying to replicate a curse. It was an insult to the knight, a cheap forgery of immortality that dared to walk in his city. Morbius dragged himself over the remains of the third ghoul, his body rejecting the corrupted dead blood he had tried to ingest. His vision blurred red. He was a scientist who had sought to cure a blood disease and had instead become its vector. Now he was trapped in a timeline where the disease was not scientific, but theological. He looked up at the burning sky, his red eyes narrowing. He did not know this world, but he knew the anatomy of a throat. And looking at the chaos engulfing London, he realized with a sinking horror that he was no longer the monster in the dark. In this city, he was the prey. The burning of London was not merely a military event, but a thermodynamic anomaly that Michael Morbius could feel vibrating in his marrow. He moved across the rooftops of Southwark with a gait that defied the crude mechanics of human locomotion, his skeletal structure reinforced by the retrovirus, allowing him to absorb kinetic impact that would pulverize a normal man. The air was thick with the particulate matter of incinerated history, ash from centuries-old tapestries mixed with the acrid smoke of modern propellants, creating a smog that clogged his enhanced olfactory senses. He was starving. The metabolic furnace that kept his condition in check was running on fumes demanding the specific protein sequences and iron-rich hemoglobin found only in living human blood. He had learned quickly in the last 20 minutes that the dead walking the streets were useless to him. The ghouls were husks devoid of the bioenergy he required, and the artificial vampires of this millennium organization were pumped full of strange preservatives and electronic components that tasted of battery acid and rot. He needed a donor. The morality of his previous life as a Nobel Prize-seeking biochemist warred with the predatory instincts of the living vampire. In his own timeline, he had sworn to consume only the guilty, but here in this apocalypse, guilt was a nebulous concept. Everyone was dying. To survive, he would have to steal life from those already slated for execution. He perched on the gargoyle of a crumbling bank building, his red eyes scanning the chaotic street layout below. His echolocation mapped the environment in a three-dimensional wireframe of sound. He could hear the distinct heartbeats of the survivors huddled in basements and the rhythmic mechanical marching of the invaders. But there was a third sound, a heavy thumping sound, wet and powerful, coming from the north. It sounded like a biological engine of war. Morbius leaped from the perch, his arms extending. The membranes under his arms caught the updrafts of the firestorms, allowing him to glide with the silent grace of a predator. He was not flying through magic. He was utilizing the physics of lift and drag, his hollow bones making him lighter than he appeared. He landed in a shattered intersection near Waterloo Station, where a squad of Millennium soldiers was dragging a group of civilians out of a cellar. The soldiers were laughing. It was a sound devoid of mirth, a programmed response to cruelty. Morbius did not announce his presence. He calculated the trajectory of the nearest soldier, drop-kicking him with enough force to cave in the vampire's chest cavity. The soldier flew back into a brick wall, exploding into dust. The civilians screamed. To them, he was just another monster, another silhouette in the fog. Morbius turned to the remaining soldiers, his claws extending. He analyzed their stance. They were undisciplined, relying entirely on their supernatural durability. That was their error. Morbius was a man of science, and he knew that even the supernatural had structural weaknesses. He ducked under a swung rifle moving faster than the soldier's optic nerves could track. He slashed the tendons of the second soldier's knees, forcing him down, then drove his palm upward into the creature's jaw. The head snapped back but did not detach. These things were durable. Morbius growled, frustration rising. He grabbed the soldier by the throat and slammed him into the pavement. He needed to know what they were made of. He ripped the uniform open, exposing the grey chest. There were surgical scars, incision lines that had healed badly. This was not a curse. This was surgery. Crude industrial surgery. He felt a moment of revulsion, not as a monster, but as a doctor. Someone had done this to them. Someone had taken the scientific method and perverted it into mass production of death. The third soldier fired his MP-40. The bullet struck Morbius in the back. Pain flared hot and bright, but his platelets were already swarming the wound sites, clotting the blood in seconds. He spun around, his eyes glowing with a feral intensity. He unleashed a sonic scream, a focused frequency of sound that shattered the auditory canals of the soldiers and ruptured the capillaries in their eyes. They dropped their weapons, clutching their heads. Morbius did not hesitate. He dismantled them with clinical precision, separating heads from spines until only dust remained. The civilians were staring at him, huddled against a burning taxi. A woman held a child, her eyes wide with terror. Morbius took a step toward them, the hunger pulsing in his gut. He could hear the rush of blood in their veins, a siren song of sustenance. The child had a scrape on his knee. The scent of that single drop of fresh oxygenated blood hit Morbius like a physical blow. His mouth watered, his fangs aching. He took another step, his hand reaching out not to harm but to beg. He needed just a little. A pint. He could stabilize them. He could save them if they just gave him a little fuel. The woman screamed and threw a piece of debris at him. It bounced harmlessly off his shoulder. The rejection stung more than the bullets. He was trying to be the hero. He was trying to contain the monster. But to them, he was indistinguishable from the Nazis. He hissed, turning away from the temptation. He could not feed on the innocent. Not yet. He launched himself back into the air, leaving the survivors to their confusion. He needed a criminal. He needed an enemy combatant who was actually alive. The realization hit him as he soared over the Thames. The Millennium forces were all undead. The Hellsing forces were fighting them. But surely they were looters, opportunists. No, the city was too far gone. The ecosystem of London had been simplified to predator and prey. He was an apex predator with nothing to eat. He landed on the roof of a train station, panting heavily. His healing factor was slowing down. The bullet wounds in his back were itching, a sign that his body was cannibalizing its own resources to repair the damage. He needed to think. He needed a lab. If he could not find blood, he might be able to synthesize a substitute if he could find a pharmacy or a hospital that hadn't been leveled. He checked his surroundings. To the west, the sky was dominated by the massive airships. To the east, the fighting was thickest. He sensed a massive concentration of bioenergy in the center of the city, a beacon of power that felt familiar yet alien. It felt like Alucard. Morbius had read the dossier on Dracula, the myths, the legends. He had dismissed them as folklore masking a genetic anomaly. But the thing in the center of London was no anomaly. It was a singularity. He decided to head toward the periphery of the conflict, hoping to find a field hospital. As he moved through the shadows of the alleyways near Covent Garden, he sensed a new presence. It was not the cold rot of Millennium, nor the terrified warmth of civilians. It was a burning, aggressive heat. He stopped, clinging to the side of a building. Below him, a group of Vatican executioners moved through the street. They were dressed in white robes, stained with soot and blood. They carried heavy weaponry and radiated a fanaticism that Morbius could almost taste. They were killing everything that moved. Ghouls, vampires, civilians who got in the way. They were sterilizing the area. Morbius watched as one of the executioners, a woman with glasses and short hair, executed a wounded police officer who had been bitten but had not yet turned. It was a mercy killing perhaps, but the efficiency of it chilled Morbius. These were the Iscariot forces. He had heard whispers of the Vatican's Section 13. In his own world usually dismissed as conspiracy theories. Here, they were a paramilitary reality. The woman Heinkel Wolf paused reloading her pistols. She looked up, scanning the rooftops. Her instincts were sharp. She stared right at the patch of shadow where Morbius hung. He held his breath, slowing his heart rate to a near standstill, a trick he had mastered to ambush prey. She frowned and moved on. But behind her walked a giant, a man who towered over the others, wearing a grey trench coat and a look of ecstatic violence. Father Alexander Anderson. Morbius felt a spike of fear that had nothing to do with biology. This man felt like a natural disaster. Anderson stopped sniffing the air. He held a bayonet in each hand, the silver blades glinting in the firelight. He turned slowly, looking directly at Morbius. The camouflage of shadow meant nothing to him. Anderson grinned, and it was a terrifying expression filled with razor-sharp teeth and absolute conviction. He did not speak. He threw a bayonet. The blade moved with impossible speed, faster than the bullets Morbius had dodged earlier. It slammed into the brickwork inches from Morbius's head, sinking deep into the masonry. Morbius dropped, landing in a crouch in the middle of the street. He hissed, baring his fangs. Anderson laughed a deep rumbling sound. He pulled more bayonets from his coat, seemingly from nowhere. He identified Morbius not as a specific entity, but as a category. A Draculina, a freak, a target. Morbius raised his hands, palms open. He tried to speak to reason. He was a doctor. He was not with the Nazis. He was a victim of circumstance. But Anderson was not listening to words. He was listening to the presence of unholy energy. He charged. Morbius had fought Spider-Man. He had fought Venom. He was accustomed to opponents with superhuman agility and strength. But Anderson was different. Anderson did not fight like a superhero or a villain. He fought like a force of nature. He closed the distance in a heartbeat, slashing downward with crossed blades. Morbius backflipped his coat, swirling around him, the silver tips grazing his chest. The pain was immediate and searing. It wasn't just physical trauma. The silver burned like white phosphorus on contact. Morbius roared, kicking out, striking Anderson in the solar plexus. It felt like kicking a concrete pillar. Anderson didn't even flinch. He absorbed the blow and headbutted Morbius, cracking the vampire's nose. Morbius stumbled back, vision swimming. His scientific mind raced. How was this man so dense? His muscle density must be 3 times that of a normal human. But he moved with fluid grace. Morbius unleashed a flurry of claws, slashing at Anderson's arms and face. He connected. Deep gouges appeared in the priest's face. Blood sprayed. But before Morbius could capitalize on the injury, the wounds began to steam. The flesh knit itself back together in seconds. No scabs, no scarring, just instant regeneration. It was faster than Morbius's own healing. It was impossible. Cellular division could not occur that rapidly without consuming the host's entire caloric intake. Anderson should be starving to death in seconds, but he was laughing. He called Morbius a heathen insect. He threw a storm of bayonets, a wall of silver steel. Morbius was forced to the defensive, dodging, weaving, using his radar sense to predict the trajectory of 20 blades at once. One caught him in the thigh, pinning him to a parked car. Morbius screamed, grabbing the blade. His hand sizzled as he touched the silver. He ripped it out the wound, smoking. He was losing this fight. He was outclassed not in speed, but in durability and sheer ferocity. Anderson walked forward reciting scripture, his voice booming over the sound of explosions. He raised a blade to deliver a killing blow. Morbius prepared to die. He prepared for the end of his tragic, misguided life. But the blow never landed. A massive round from a localized anti-tank rifle struck Anderson in the shoulder, blowing the priest sideways into a storefront. The impact was thunderous. Morbius looked up. Standing on a rooftop hundreds of yards away was a silhouette backlit by the moon. A girl in a yellow uniform holding a gun that belonged on a battleship. Ceres Victoria. She did not know who Morbius was. She saw a monster fighting the Vatican. In the chaos of the night, she made a choice. She fired again, providing suppressing fire. Morbius did not waste the opportunity. He launched himself upward, ignoring the pain in his leg. He needed to get away. He needed to regroup. He glided over the rooftops, fleeing the battle, leaving the mad priest roaring in the wreckage. He did not stop until he reached the entrance of an abandoned London Underground station near Piccadilly. He collapsed on the tiled floor of the ticket hall, gasping for air. His body was wreck. The silver burns were not healing. They were festering, turning black. The metal had disrupted his cellular cohesion. He dragged himself down the escalator into the darkness of the tunnels. The air down here was cooler, stale, but safe from the fire. He found a maintenance closet and kicked the door in. He sat in the dark, trembling. The hunger was now a roaring fire. He had exerted too much energy. He was entering the fugue state, the feral madness that took over when his glucose levels dropped too low. He needed blood, any blood. He looked at his own arm. He could not feed on himself. It would violate the laws of thermodynamics. He needed external input. He remembered the soldier he had slashed, the one whose blood he had tasted on the air. He had a sample, a smear of Anderson's blood on his claws. It was dried, crusted, but it was biological material. Desperate, Morbius scraped the dried blood from his claw and touched it to his tongue. The reaction was violent. It was not food. It was like swallowing a live electrical wire. He convulsed, gagging. The blood was charged with something that his biology recognized as toxic. It was holy. It was consecrated. It burned his throat. He retched, spitting out the bile. He lay on the cold concrete, curling into a ball. He was trapped in a city where the humans were being slaughtered. The soldiers were inedible ghosts, and the priest tasted like poison. He was a man of science who had fallen into a world of nightmares. And for the first time since his transformation, Michael Morbius wept not out of sadness, but out of sheer terrifying impotence. He was the living vampire, but here he was just another dying animal. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time was distorted by the pain. Morbius drifted in and out of consciousness. His body was prioritizing. It shut down his higher brain functions to focus on repairing the silver burns. He dreamed of his lab in New York. He dreamed of Martine. He dreamed of the white, sterile lights of the hospital. Then he woke up. The silence of the tunnel was broken by footsteps. Not the marching of soldiers, not the heavy tread of the priest. These were light, stumbling steps. The steps of someone injured. Morbius lifted his head. His eyes adjusted to the pitch blackness. He could see the heat signature coming down the tunnel. It was a human, a male, wounded, bleeding. The scent of fresh, iron-rich blood wafted down the corridor, overpowering the smell of ozone and rat droppings. It was a dinner bell. Morbius stood up. His leg had healed enough to bear weight. The silver burns were still raw but scabbing over. The rational part of his brain, the part that was doctor. Morbius screamed at him to stop. This was a survivor, a victim. But the monster, the thing that the retrovirus had created, silenced the doctor. The monster smelled the hemoglobin. The monster heard the faltering heartbeat. Morbius moved into the center of the tracks, waiting. The figure emerged from the gloom. It was a British soldier separated from his unit. He was clutching his side, his uniform soaked in dark, wet blood. He saw Morbius standing there, a gaunt, pale figure with glowing red eyes. The soldier raised his rifle, but he was too weak. He collapsed to his knees, coughing. "Help me," the soldier whispered. "Please." It was the ultimate test. Morbius looked at the man. He could snap his neck in an instant. He could drain him dry and be back to full strength in minutes. He could heal the burns. He could fight Anderson again and win. All he had to do was cross the line he had drawn for himself. The line between man and monster. The hunger was a physical pain, a cramping in his stomach that bent him double. His fangs extended, dripping with saliva. He took a step forward. The soldier closed his eyes, accepting his fate. Morbius knelt beside him. He grabbed the soldier's collar. The neck was right there, the jugular vein pulsing a rhythmic beat of life. Morbius opened his mouth. He could feel the heat of the skin. He stopped. He froze, his hand trembling. He saw the soldier's dog tags. Private J. Miller, Anglican, typo positive, a name, a life. Morbius pulled back, snarling at himself, hitting the concrete floor with his fist. He could not do it. If he did this, he was no better than the things destroying the city. He was a doctor. He saved lives. He did not take them. With a superhuman effort of will, he suppressed the urge. He grabbed the soldier's medical kit from his belt. He tore it open with shaking hands. He pulled out a morphine syringe and a field dressing. "I am not a monster." Morbius grit out, his voice rasping and distorted. He applied the dressing to the soldier's wound, putting pressure on the bleeding. The soldier opened his eyes, staring at the vampire in shock. Who are you?" Morbius finished binding the wound. The bleeding slowed. The scent diminished slightly, but was still maddening. "I'm a doctor," Morbius whispered, "and you need to be quiet." He picked the soldier up effortlessly, carrying him like a child. He could not eat him, so he would use him. He would use him as a compass. Where there was one soldier, there might be a command post. A place with medical supplies, blood packs, stored blood meant for transfusions. That was the solution. He didn't need to kill. He needed a blood bank. Morbius began to run down the tunnel, carrying Private Miller deeper into the underground network. He was betting his life on the logic of military logistics. If he could find a field hospital, he could survive. If not, he would eventually lose control and eat the man in his arms. It was a race against his own metabolism. Above ground, the war escalated. The Millennium airships began their bombardment, leveling entire city blocks. The Deus Ex Machina hovered over the carnage, a dark god of technology. On the bridge, the Major reviewed the footage from the earlier skirmish. He replayed the clip of Morbius fighting Anderson. The Major smiled a wide, unnerving grin. "Doc," he said, addressing the mad scientist beside him, "what do you make of this?" The doctor adjusted his multi-lens spectacles, peering at the screen. He analyzed the movement patterns, the lack of magical aura, the biological heat signature. "It is fascinating," the doctor murmured. "No necromancy, no midichlorians, no chi, purely biological enhancement. He's a mutant or a construct, but his cellular degradation is rapid. He's unstable." The Major laughed, clapping his hands. A third element. How wonderful. The Vatican has its monsters. We have ours. And now a wild card enters the deck. A creature of science in a war of magic. I want him. I want to see what makes him tick. Send the werewolves. Send Schrödinger. No. Wait. The Major paused, watching Morbius save the soldier on a different monitor feed tapped from the London surveillance grid. He has morality. How quaint. How human. He is fighting his own nature. Let him run. Let him starve. Let us see how long his science holds up against the hunger. When he breaks, he will be a magnificent weapon. The Major turned back to the window, watching London burn. But keep an eye on him. If the Vatican kills him, I will be very disappointed. I want his corpse for my collection. Deep in the tunnels, Morbius found a maintenance station that had been converted into a temporary triage center. It was abandoned, overrun hours ago. Bodies lay on stretchers covered in sheets. The staff had fled or died, but the generator was still humming. Morbius laid Private Miller on a cot. The soldier was unconscious but stable. Morbius tore through the cabinets, throwing boxes of gauze and syringes aside. He found a refrigerator. It was locked. He ripped the door off its hinges. Inside were rows of plastic bags. Red, precious, life. Morbius grabbed a bag of O negative. He didn't bother with an IV line. He bit into the plastic, piercing the bag with his fangs. He drained it in seconds. The relief was instantaneous. The cold liquid fire spread through his veins, kick-starting his system. His vision sharpened. The pain in his back faded to a dull throb. The burns on his hands began to close. He drank another and another. 3 bags, enough to restore him to peak efficiency. He wiped his mouth, his hands steady again. He looked at the labels. National Blood Service. He had found his fuel source. But he also found something else. On a desk in the corner was a radio. It was crackling with static. Morbius tuned it, his sensitive hearing picking up the encrypted channels. He heard voices, panic, orders, and then a specific frequency, a transmission from the Hellsing organization. All units fall back to Hellsing Manor. The enemy is converging. We are initiating the release of Control Alt Restriction Level 1. Morbius did not know what that meant, but he heard the name Hellsing. It was the name of the family that hunted Dracula. If they were real, then Dracula was real. And if Dracula was real, he was the key. Morbius looked at the blood bags. He had enough for a day, maybe 2. But he was trapped in a timeline where science was the underdog. To survive, he needed to understand the rules of this magic. He needed to study a true vampire. He grabbed a satchel, filling it with blood bags. He checked Miller one last time. The soldier would live. Morbius wrote a note on a medical chart. Keep wound clean. Stay quiet. He signed it Dr. M. He turned and headed back up the tunnel. He was going to Hellsing Manor. He was going to find this Alucard, not to fight him, but to diagnose him. Morbius was done running. He was a scientist and he had a new specimen to investigate. The breach was open. The experiment had begun. He emerged from the subway station into the night, the fires of London reflecting in his red eyes. He was no longer just a victim of the crossover. He was a variable, and he was heading straight into the heart of the storm. The collision of his pseudo-science with the dark magic of the Hellsing family was inevitable. He checked his bearings, adjusted his coat, and leapt into the smoke-filled sky, gliding toward the distant estate, where the true monsters waited. The breach was absolute. Now came the consequences. The flight from London to the Hellsing estate was a lesson in the geography of hell. Michael Morbius glided on the thermal currents rising from the burning suburbs, his night vision capturing the sprawling devastation of the English countryside. The city behind him was a crater of noise, but the darkness ahead was silent and heavy. He was running on the stolen blood of the National Health Service, a cocktail of preservatives and anticoagulants that kept his hunger at bay but dulled his edges. It was fast food fuel for a high-performance engine. He needed to understand the apex predator of this world. His scientific mind, unable to accept magic as an answer, had formulated a hypothesis. This Alucard was patient zero, a carrier of a supervirus that allowed for total cellular regeneration and mass shifting. If Morbius could isolate the genome of this king of vampires, he could perhaps synthesize a cure for his own condition, or at the very least, a stabilizer that did not require the ingestion of human blood. He was approaching the Hellsing Manor not as a savior, but as a field researcher, breaking into a containment zone. The estate appeared on the horizon, a Gothic fortress besieged by a green fog. Morbius banked sharply, his echolocation pinging the topography. The fog was not meteorological. It was dense structured and smelled of ozone and mind-altering pheromones. On the ground, he detected the heat signatures of dozens of soldiers engaging in close-quarters combat. The defenders were human, their heartbeats rapid and frantic. The attackers were the same cold-bodied constructs he had fought in the city. Morbius folded his arms and dived, reaching a terminal velocity of 120 miles per hour, before snapping his wings open at the last second to flare his descent. He landed in the courtyard of the Hellsing Manor, with a cratering impact kicking up dirt and manicured grass. The combatants froze. To the mercenaries of the wild geese, he was another monster dropping from the sky. To the Nazi vampires of the Millennium Battalion, he was the anomaly the Major had warned them about. Morbius stood slowly dusting off his trench coat. He scanned the area. A massive woman with tattoos covering half her body and wielding a scythe stood at the center of the carnage. Zorin Blitz. Her bioenergy reading was off the charts, pulsing with a hypnotic rhythm that Morbius's sensors interpreted as a neuro-broadcast. She looked at him and smiled, a jagged expression of genuine curiosity. She did not speak. She simply exerted her will. The green fog swirled. To the soldiers of the wild geese, the world dissolved into their worst nightmares. Giant hands emerged from the ground. The sky rained blood. Loved ones screamed in agony. But Morbius blinked, his red eyes clearing. His brain was not wired for magic. His perception of reality was based on echolocation and thermal gradients. He saw the visual hallucination for what it was, a projection of light and telepathic suggestion. But his radar saw the truth. The giant hands were not there. The blood rain was not there. Zorin Blitz was standing still, sweating, concentrating on the projection. Morbius tilted his head. The illusion failed to anchor in his synapses, because his synapses were fundamentally different, modified by bat DNA and artificial retroviruses. He was colorblind to her magic. Zorin frowned, her tattoo writhing. She intensified the projection, pushing a nightmare into his mind. She sought his trauma. She found it. Suddenly, Morbius was back in the lab. The white rats were dying. Emil was dying. The cure was a failure. The guilt slammed into him, a chemical sledgehammer. But Morbius had lived with this guilt every second of every day for years. It was not a weapon she could use against him. It was his baseline state of existence. He snarled, a sound of pure scientific rejection. He lunged. Zorin gasped, realizing her error too late. She swung the scythe, a massive crescent of steel meant to cleave souls. Morbius ducked under the blade, moving with the kinetic snap of a whip. He did not aim for her head. He aimed for her center of gravity. He tackled her, driving his shoulder into her midsection. They crashed through a stone fountain, water and masonry exploding around them. The illusion over the courtyard shattered. The wild geese blinked, shaking their heads, the nightmare lifting. They saw the pale stranger pinning the Nazi commander to the ground. Zorin screamed in rage and kicked Morbius off, sending him skidding across the wet grass. She stood up, her eyes glowing purple. She was no longer playing. She swung the scythe again, and this time the blade glowed with magical energy. Morbius dodged, but the air pressure alone cut his cheek. He analyzed the weapon. It was disrupting the air molecules, creating a vacuum edge. He needed to disarm her. He fired a sonic blast, a focused cone of decibels directly at her inner ear. Zorin staggered, clutching her head, blood running from her nose, her balance compromised. Morbius closed the distance. He grabbed the handle of the scythe, his grip crushing the wood. He was stronger than he looked. His muscles were hydraulic systems of condensed fiber. He wrenched the weapon from her grasp and tossed it aside. Zorin looked at him with genuine fear. He was not playing by the rules of the night. He was not monologuing about destiny. He was dismantling her with the efficiency of a vivisectionist. Morbius grabbed her by the throat, lifting her off the ground. He needed data. He needed to know how these creatures sustain themselves without decay. He extended his fangs not to kill but to sample. He bit into her neck. This was the catastrophe. The moment Morbius's fangs pierced the skin of Zorin Blitz, the laws of two universes collided. He expected blood. He expected biological fluid plasma platelets. What he got was a high-pressure injection of dark matter. Zorin was not just a biological entity. She was the vessel of the Major's artificial vampirism, a chaotic mix of technology, alchemy, and concentrated will. But deeper than that, she had consumed souls to fuel her regeneration. When Morbius tried to drink, he did not just ingest fluid. He ingested the essence of her victims. In the Marvel Universe, souls were distinct metaphysical entities, usually the domain of demons like Mephisto or gods like Thor. They were not dietary supplements. Morbius's digestive system, designed to process hemoglobin, went into immediate anaphylactic shock. The souls rushed into him, a chorus of screaming voices that had no place in his biology. His mind fractured. It wasn't a headache, it was a rewrite of his operating system. He saw the memories of 1,000 dead soldiers. He felt the cold fanaticism of the Millennium Organization. He felt the Major's madness. Morbius released Zorin, gagging violently. He fell to his knees, clawing at his throat. His veins turned black, visible through his pale skin. The retrovirus in his blood, which constantly repaired his DNA, identified the foreign soul energy as a cancer. It attacked the magic. The conflict between science and magic took place on a cellular level inside Morbius's body. He screamed a sound that started human and ended as a frequency that cracked the paving stones of the courtyard. Smoke poured from his eyes and mouth. His body began to mutate. Bone spurs erupted from his spine. His muscle mass doubled, tearing his trench coat. The living vampire was becoming a dying abomination. Zorin, recovering her breath, laughed. She saw what was happening. He had tried to eat a curse and he was choking on it. She retrieved her scythe, raising it to decapitate the thrashing scientist. But she was interrupted. A bullet made of depleted uranium and blessed silver the size of a soda can took her arm off at the shoulder. Sarah's Victoria had arrived. The police girl stood on the balcony of the manor, holding the Harkonnen cannon, her eyes red with the fury of a true vampire. She did not know who Morbius was, but she knew he had fought Zorin. The enemy of my enemy is a target for later. Right now, Zorin was the threat. Zorin shrieked, retreating into the shadows, her regeneration slowed by the sheer mass of the trauma. The wild geese opened fire, driving the Millennium forces back. The courtyard was a kill zone. Morbius lay in the center of it, his body warring with itself. The voices in his head were deafening. Kill them, eat them, serve the major, die. He forced his mind to focus on the periodic table. Hydrogen, helium, lithium. He recited the atomic weights, anchoring himself in the empirical truth of the universe. He was Michael Morbius. He was a Nobel Prize winner. He was not a vessel for ghosts. He reached into his coat with a trembling hand and pulled out a syringe of his own serum, a concoction of bat enzymes he used to stabilize his transformations. He jammed it directly into his heart. The shock was instant. The enzymes flooded his system, acting as a chemical firebreak. The foreign soul energy was not destroyed, but it was encapsulated, walled off by the rapid growth of new cells. The mutations receded. The bone spurs retracted. Morbius gasped, lying flat on his back, staring at the smoke-filled sky. He was alive, but he was different. He could feel the souls inside him now, not as voices, but as a heavy, cold weight in his gut. He had just integrated a metaphysical power source into a biological engine. He looked at his hand. A faint, dark aura shimmered around his claws. He had adapted. Evolution through trauma. He sat up just as Sarah's Victoria landed in front of him. The young vampiress looked at him with a mix of suspicion and confusion. She smelled the blood on him. It smelled like Zorin, but it also smelled like chemicals and old paper. Identify yourself, Ceres ordered, training the massive cannon on his chest. You're not Millennium. You fought the witch, but you're not human. Morbius stood up slowly, holding his hands out in a placating gesture. He was exhausted. His hunger was gone, replaced by a sickening fullness. I am Dr. Michael Morbius, he rasped. I am a refugee. I require sanctuary. Ceres hesitated. Her master, Alucard, was not there. Integra was inside coordinating the defense. She had to make a call. The man was clearly dangerous, but he had saved the wild geese from the illusion. Get inside, she barked, gesturing to the heavy oak doors of the manor. If you try anything, I'll blow you in half. Morbius nodded. He limped toward the manor, the sounds of the renewed assault ringing behind him. He entered the great hall of the Hellsing estate. It was a fortress of tradition. Oil paintings of vampire hunters lined the walls, but the floor was covered in shell casings and medical supplies. He was met by the remaining mercenaries who eyed him with hostility. Morbius ignored them. He found a corner and collapsed, sitting against the wall. He needed to analyze what had just happened. He ran a diagnostic on his own physiology. His heart rate was slower. His temperature had dropped 10 degrees, and he could hear the house, not the acoustics. He could hear the residual psychic imprints of the people who had lived there. The magic he had ingested had expanded his sensory input into the paranormal spectrum. It was terrifying. He was a radio suddenly picking up a frequency he didn't believe existed. Suddenly, the air in the room changed. The pressure dropped. The lights flickered and died. A shadow moved across the floor independent of any light source. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a presence so massive it made the air feel like water. Morbius looked up. Standing at the top of the grand staircase was not Alucard, but the head of the Hellsing organization, Sir Integra Fairbrook Wingates. She held a cigar in one hand and a silver pistol in the other. She looked down at the intruder with eyes of ice. My report says you eat Nazis, she said, her voice cutting through the tension. That is the only reason you are still breathing on my carpet. Morbius stood, respecting the authority in her voice. This was a leader. I eat organisms that threaten my survival, Morbius corrected. The Nazis are merely plentiful. Integra descended the stairs, her heels clicking on the wood. She stopped a few feet from him. She studied his face. The gaunt features, the red eyes, the scientific desperation. "You are not a vampire," she stated. It was not a question. "You are a biology experiment gone wrong." Morbius stiffened. "I am a living vampire, a product of pseudo-vampirism. My condition is viral, not whatever this is." He gestured to the chaotic world outside. Integra took a drag of her cigar. "Pseudo-vampirism. Man trying to replicate the work of God or the devil. How typical." She walked past him toward the window, looking out at the burning grounds. "We are under siege by the Millennium Battalion. They are true vampires, artificial but magical. You discovered the hard way that you cannot consume them." Morbius nodded. "Their blood, it screams." Integra glanced back at him. "Souls, Doctor. You are trying to digest souls with a stomach built for proteins. You will poison yourself." She turned to face him fully. "But you survived, which means you are adaptable. And right now, I am short on resources." A massive explosion rocked the building. Dust fell from the ceiling. "My ace is returning," Integra said, referring to Alucard. "But until he arrives, we must hold this line. Can you fight without trying to eat my enemies and dying in the process?" Morbius clenched his fists. He felt the new power in his blood, the dark residue of Zorin's energy. He could use it. He could burn it as fuel. "I can fight," Morbius said, "but I want access to your archives. I want to know what Alucard is. I want the data." Integra smiled a grim, humorless expression. "If we survive the night, you can read whatever you want. If we die, it won't matter." The truce was struck, but the universe had a way of punishing hubris. The wall of the East Wing exploded inward. Debris flew across the hall. Through the smoke stepped a new threat. It wasn't Zorin. It was the captain, the silent werewolf of Millennium. He wore a greatcoat and a cap pulled low over his eyes. He did not carry a weapon. He was the weapon. He looked at Seras, then at the mercenaries, and finally his gaze settled on Morbius. The captain sniffed the air. He smelled the anomaly. He smelled the science, and he found it offensive. The captain moved. He was a blur of grey motion. Seras fired her cannon, but the captain simply missed it, shifting his density to avoid the shell, then reformed instantly. He was in front of Morbius in a millisecond. Morbius reacted on instinct, his radar sense warning him of the density shift. He crossed his arms to block. The captain's kick hit him like a freight train. Morbius was launched backwards, smashing through the heavy oak doors of the library and tumbling into the shelves. He groaned, buried under a pile of ancient books. His arm was broken, again, but it was healing. He looked up. The captain was walking toward him, calmly unhurried. This was a creature of pure physical supremacy. Magic encased in flesh. Morbius scrambled back. He couldn't overpower this thing. He had to outthink it. He grabbed a handful of books, throwing them as a distraction. The captain swatted them away. Morbius realized with a sinking heart that he was trapped in a room with a monster that outclassed him in every metric. But then he saw it. The captain's eyes. They were focused not on Morbius's throat, but on his movement. The captain was analyzing his fighting style. He was bored. He wanted a challenge. Morbius stood up his lab coat, shredded his chest bare and pale. He tapped into the reserve of soul energy he had absorbed from Zorin. It felt cold and oily. He pushed it into his muscles. His speed increased. He blurred, rushing the captain. He didn't strike. He slid between the werewolf's legs, slashing the femoral artery. The captain grunted, surprised. The wound healed instantly, but Morbius had drawn blood. First blood. Morbius landed on a bookshelf, crouching. "I am not a chew toy," Morbius hissed. The captain smiled, revealing massive fangs. "Finally, a game." The werewolf transformed his body, expanding fur erupting his face, elongating into a muzzle of pure predatory nightmare. He roared a sound that shook the foundations of the house. Morbius realized he had just escalated the fight from a skirmish to a deathmatch. He was locked in a library with a demigod of destruction, and his only weapon was a contaminated bloodstream and a desperate intellect. This was the catastrophic escalation. He was no longer an observer. He was a participant in the war of monsters, and he was fighting for the right to remain a man of science in a room rapidly filling with the stench of magic and wet fur. As the captain lunged, Morbius calculated the breaking strain of the floorboards. If he couldn't beat the wolf, he would drop the building on top of him. He slammed his fists into the ground, channeling the soul energy into a shockwave. The floor collapsed. Both monsters fell into the darkness of the basement, the battle continuing in the free fall. The dark in the dust with the realization that Morbius could not diagnose this world without becoming part of its disease. The basement of the Hellsing Manor was not merely a storage area for vintage wines and discarded heirlooms. It was a subterranean labyrinth of reinforced concrete and damp earth that smelled of centuries of buried secrets. Michael Morbius plummeted into this darkness entangled with the captain. The two of them, a twisting knot of fur and synthetic fabric, crashing through floorboards and support beams. They struck the stone floor of the lower cellar with a force that registered as a seismic event in the immediate vicinity. Morbius absorbed the impact, his skeletal structure flexing and snapping back into place, thanks to the pseudo-vampiric elasticity of his cartilage. The captain, however, did not flex. He landed with the solidity of a tank turret, simply ceasing to move upon impact, his mass seeming to increase at the moment of collision to crush his opponent. Morbius rolled away, coughing up dust and blood, his radar sense screaming at him. The darkness down here was absolute, a perfect void that rendered human eyes useless. But for Morbius, it was a wireframe map of acoustic reflections. He could hear the drip of water from a cracked pipe 20 meters away. He could hear the settling of the house's foundation above, and he could hear the captain's heart. It was a slow, rhythmic thud, like a pile driver striking mud. It was the heartbeat of something that did not need to pump blood to survive, but did so out of habit. The captain rose from the debris, his greatcoat shedding dust like water. He did not growl. He did not posture. He simply adjusted his cap and raised his fists in a boxing stance that dated back to the bare-knuckle era of the Victorian prize rings. Morbius hissed, scrambling up the side of a wine rack, his claws digging into the ancient wood. He was outmatched in every physical metric. The captain was faster, stronger, and seemingly impervious to blunt force trauma. Morbius needed a force multiplier. He looked at the wine bottles. Alcohol, ethanol, flammable. He grabbed a bottle of 19th century Bordeaux and hurled it not at the captain, but at the fuse box on the far wall, which had been sparked by their entry. The bottle shattered, dousing the electrical components in vintage alcohol. A spark caught. Blue fire erupted, casting long, jagged shadows across the cellar. The captain tilted his head, slightly impressed by the improvisation, but unconcerned by the flame. He lunged. This time Morbius did not try to block. He utilized the aerodynamic lift of his gliding membranes to propel himself sideways, banking off a stone pillar. The captain's fist punched a hole through the pillar, pulverizing the granite as if it were drywall. The structural integrity of the basement groaned. Morbius realized that a prolonged engagement here would bring the entire manor down on top of them, burying the Hellsing organization and his only chance of survival. He needed to incapacitate the werewolf, not defeat him. Morbius landed on a high shelf, his mind racing. He still had the residual energy from Zorin Blitz in his system, that heavy necrotic weight that tasted of other people's souls. It was a toxin, but perhaps it was also a weapon. He focused on that sensation, dragging the dark energy from his gut into his throat. It felt like swallowing razor blades. He opened his mouth and unleashed a sonic scream, but he modulated the frequency, weaving the necromantic energy into the sound waves. It was a hybrid attack, a scientific sonic blast carrying a magical payload. The sound hit the captain dead center. The werewolf stumbled. The sonic impact disrupted his equilibrium, but the soul energy did something else. It interfered with his shape-shifting mist form. The captain's outline flickered his body, trying to turn into mist to negate the damage, but the Zorin energy acted as a binding agent, forcing him to remain solid. He growled a low, dangerous sound of annoyance. Morbius dropped from the ceiling, landing on the captain's back. He didn't bite. He didn't claw. He injected. Morbius had kept a syringe of an anticoagulant compound in his belt, a concentrated heparin solution he used for his own blood experiments. He jammed the needle into the captain's neck, depressing the plunger. It wouldn't kill him. But if the werewolf's physiology relied on rapid clotting to sustain his regeneration, this would disrupt the cascade. The captain roared, reaching back and gripping Morbius by the skull. The pressure was immense. Morbius felt his cranial plates shifting. He was thrown across the room, smashing into a wall of wine barrels. Red wine exploded outwards, soaking him, looking for all the world like blood. Morbius lay there gasping. The captain pulled the syringe from his neck and crushed it. The wound bled freely, the anticoagulant doing its work. The captain wiped the blood, looked at it, and then looked at Morbius with a gaze that promised an eternity of pain. But before the final blow could be struck, the ceiling vibrated. It was not the vibration of artillery or bombs. It was a resonance, a deep hum that started in the atmosphere and drove itself into the bedrock. Morbius felt it in his teeth. His radar sense went whiteout, blinded by a sudden influx of psychic static. Above them, on the surface, something massive had arrived. The captain froze. His ears twitched. He knew that vibration. He abandoned Morbius, turning his back on the scientist and leaping upward, jumping through the hole in the ceiling with a single, impossible bound. He was needed elsewhere. Morbius was left alone in the wreckage of the wine cellar, soaked in alcohol and his own blood, shivering, as the temperature in the room dropped 30 degrees in a second. He was not safe. He was simply ignored. Morbius dragged himself up, slipping on the wine-slicked floor. He had to see. The scientist in him demanded observation. He climbed the debris, emerging back into the great hall of the manor. The battle had stopped. The mercenaries, the ghouls, the vampires, they were all standing still, looking toward the main entrance. The heavy doors had been blown open. Through the smoke, a figure walked. He wore a red coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He carried 2 massive handguns, but they were holstered. He did not need them. Alucard had returned, and he had brought the river with him. Morbius watched from the shadows of the upper mezzanine as the Hellsing vampire walked past the stunned combatants. Alucard's presence was a radiological event. Morbius's enhanced senses, which usually perceived biological heat and electrical impulses, were now perceiving a dense, opaque void. Alucard did not register as a single organism. He registered as a legion, a containment vessel for millions of biosignatures, all screaming in unison. Morbius clutched the railing, his knuckles white. This was the antithesis of his existence. Morbius was a man trying to cure death with science. Alucard was a man who had cured death by becoming it. The confrontation between Alucard and the Millennium forces began, but it was not a fight. It was a slaughter. Alucard released his restraints. The chaotic black matter erupted from his shoulders, forming the shapes of hellhounds and eyes. He tore through the armored ranks of the Nazi vampires as if they were wet tissue paper. Morbius watched with clinical horror. He saw Alucard consume a soldier. It wasn't just feeding. It was integration. The soldier didn't die, he was absorbed. His biomass, his memories, his very existence became a line of code in Alucard's genetic software. Mass conservation, Morbius whispered to himself, his voice trembling. Where does the mass go? It's impossible, unless he is a dimensional pocket, a biological singularity. The realization terrified him. If Alucard was a living black hole, then Morbius was an astronaut drifting too close to the event horizon. Then the escalation occurred. The sky above London tore open again, not with a portal, but with the descent of the burning Zeppelin Deus Ex Machina. The Major was playing his final card, but simultaneously, a new player entered the Hellsing Hall. From the shadows behind Integra Wingates, a figure emerged. Young, wire-thin, dressed in a butler's uniform, but radiating a sharp, lethal intent that cut the air. Walter C. Dornez, the Angel of Death. But he was wrong. He was younger than the portraits. He had been altered. Morbius smelled it immediately, the same chemical stench that hung off the artificial vampires. Surgery, alchemy, betrayal. Walter lashed out his monomolecular wires slicing through the air, but he did not strike the enemy. He struck at Integra. The wires wrapped around the pillar next to her, shearing it in half. Integra stood her ground, ash falling from her cigar. Walter, she said, her voice devoid of surprise but heavy with disappointment. So you have chosen. Walter smiled a cruel, youthful expression. I have chosen time, Sir Integra. I have chosen to be the Reaper one last time. Morbius saw the trajectory. Walter was cutting off Integra's escape, isolating her. Alucard was occupied with the main army. Ceres was on the roof. Integra was vulnerable. Morbius made a calculation. If Integra died, the Hellsing organization collapsed. If Hellsing collapsed, Morbius would be alone in a city of Nazis and monsters. He had no loyalty to this woman, but he had a desperate need for her infrastructure. He moved. Morbius dove from the mezzanine, gliding silently over the heads of the confused soldiers. He intercepted the second wave of wires meant for Integra. He didn't block them. That would have sliced him to ribbons. He used his sonic scream to vibrate the air, creating a pocket of turbulence that deflected the lightweight wires by a fraction of an inch. They missed Integra's neck and embedded in the wall. Morbius landed in front of the head of Hellsing. His claws extended, his red eyes fixed on the traitorous butler. Walter paused, tilting his head. The bat, Walter sneered. The failed experiment. You are out of your depth, Doctor. This is a family quarrel. Morbius stood straight, panting. I am an oncologist, Morbius rasped. I remove tumors. And you reek of malignancy. Walter laughed, flicking his wrists. The wires danced, invisible to the naked eye, but singing to Morbius's radar. Then let us see if you can operate on a ghost. Walter attacked. This was different from the captain. The captain was a boulder. Walter was a razor blade. He controlled the space with a grid of death. Morbius was forced to dance, his evasion pushed to the absolute limit. He sensed the wires by the displacement of air twisting his body into impossible shapes to pass through the gaps. A wire grazed his shoulder, slicing through the muscle and bone. Another took a piece of his ear. He was being whittled down. He couldn't get close. Walter was zoning him perfectly. Morbius needed to close the distance. He grabbed a handful of shell casings from the floor and threw them. Not at Walter, but at the wires. The metal casings hit the wires, sparking and pinging, revealing the web for a split second. In that second, Morbius lunged. He got inside the guard. He slashed at Walter's chest. Walter backstepped fast, but Morbius caught his vest, ripping the fabric. No blood, just the grey, dead skin of the artificial vampire. "You are not even alive," Morbius hissed. "You sold your humanity for this, for youth." Walter's eyes narrowed. "I sold it for a chance to kill the king." He kicked Morbius in the chest, a precise blow that stopped the vampire's heart for a full beat. Morbius collapsed, gasping. Walter raised his hand to finish him. "Leave him." The voice was deep, resonant, and carried the weight of a tectonic shift. Alucard, the no-life king, had finished his appetizer. He stood at the entrance of the hall, covered in blood that was not his own. He looked at Walter, then at Morbius. Alucard's expression was unreadable behind his orange glasses. "The man of science," Alucard said, mocking. "Trying to be a shield. How adorable." He walked forward, ignoring the wires that Walter tensed. Alucard looked down at Morbius. "You are starving, Doctor. I can hear your cells screaming. You are fighting on empty." Morbius looked up, his vision blurring. He was indeed starving. The regeneration from the wire cuts was stalling. He needed blood, real blood, not the chemical substitute. "I will not become you." Morbius spat blood spraying from his lips. Alucard grinned. "You already are me. Just a weaker, pettier version. You cling to your rules, your science. Look around you. Physics has left the building." Alucard gestured to the burning London outside, where the river of blood was now flowing through the streets, consuming everything. "Drink," Alucard commanded, pointing to a dying Iscariot priest pinned to the wall by a bayonet. "Drink and survive, or starve and die. Science cannot save you here. Only blood can." It was the inflection point, the choice that would define Morbius's timeline in this universe. He looked at the priest. He looked at Walter, who was waiting to duel Alucard. He looked at Integra, who was reloading her pistol. He was a variable that didn't fit. If he drank, he accepted the logic of this world. If he didn't, he died. Morbius crawled toward the priest. The man was Father Makube, a subordinate of Anderson. He was dying, his lungs punctured. He looked at Morbius with hate. "Demon," he whispered. Morbius paused, his fangs hovering over the man's neck. "No," Morbius said softly. "Just desperate." He didn't kill him. He found the brachial artery and bit carefully. He didn't drain him dry. He took a pint, just enough. The surge of energy was different this time. This was the blood of a fanatic, oxygenated by faith and adrenaline. It hit Morbius like amphetamines. His eyes snapped open, glowing brighter. The wounds from Walter's wires steamed and closed. His muscles swelled. He stood up, wiping his mouth. He felt the rush of the priest's memories. Prayers, training, discipline. It stabilized the chaotic energy from Zorin he had absorbed earlier. The holy blood neutralized the Nazi curse. Equilibrium. Morbius was back. He turned to Alucard. "I have fed," Morbius said, his voice strong. "Now, I am leaving. This is your fight." Alucard laughed, a sound of genuine amusement. "Run then, little bat. Go watch the end of the world." Alucard turned his attention to Walter. The duel of the century began. Morbius did not stay to watch. He grabbed Integra Wingates. "We are moving," he stated. Integra glared. "Unhand me. I must witness this." "You will witness nothing if you are dead," Morbius countered. "My analysis confirms that the structural integrity of this building is compromised. And that creature," he gestured to Walter, "is unstable. He is going to burn out. And when he does, he will take this room with him." Morbius didn't wait for permission. He lifted the head of the Hellsing organization, throwing her over his shoulder like a sack of flour, and sprinted for the rear exit. He was saving the commander to save the command structure. He burst out into the back gardens, just as the great hall exploded behind them, a shockwave of wires and shadow tearing the roof off. Morbius landed in the wet grass, putting Integra down. She smoothed her suit, her dignity bruised, but her life intact. She looked at the burning manor. "You are insufferable," she said, "but efficient." Morbius adjusted his coat. "I am a pragmatist. Now where is the extraction point?" Before she could answer, the ground shook again. This time it wasn't the manor. It was the city. The river of death that Alucard had summoned was spreading. But something was wrong. The blood was boiling. High above the Deus Ex Machina began to descend its hull opening. The Major was initiating the final phase, and from the shadows of the garden, the thorns of Alexander Anderson began to grow. The Paladin had survived, and he was holding the nail of Helena. Morbius saw the artifact. His sensors read it not as an object, but as a whole in reality, a radioactive isotope of divinity. "What is that?" Morbius asked, pointing. Integra's face went pale. "The monster of God," she whispered. "He is going to use the nail. He is going to become a relic." Morbius watched as Anderson stabbed the nails into his own heart. The transformation was instantaneous and blinding. Thorns exploded from the priest's body, wrapping him in a cocoon of holy timber. The man disappeared, replaced by a creature of fire and wood, a burning bush in the shape of a giant. The energy output was catastrophic. It washed over Morbius, burning his skin. This was not magic. This was divine radiation. Morbius shielded his eyes, retreating. "He's nuking himself," Morbius yelled over the roar of the flames. "He's rewriting his biology into pure energy." Anderson roared a sound that sounded like a forest fire screaming. He charged back into the ruins of the manor, seeking Alucard. The clash between the Level 0 Alucard and the monster of God Anderson was about to happen, and Morbius realized with a sinking feeling that he was standing in the fallout zone. The systemic clash was absolute. Vampire versus werewolf versus paladin versus traitor. And in the middle, Michael Morbius, the man who just wanted to cure a blood disease, holding a pocket calculator to a nuclear explosion. He turned to Integra. "We need to get to high ground. The thermal output alone will sterilize this area." Integra nodded, drawing her sword. "To the roof," she ordered. "Seras is there. If we are to die, we die together." They began to climb the exterior of the crumbling manor. As they ascended, Morbius looked out over London. The city was gone, replaced by a sea of blood and fire, and in that sea he saw something that made his blood run cold. The blood of the dead. It was moving with purpose. It was flowing toward Alucard, but it was also flowing into the sewers, into the water table, into the biosphere. "The contamination," Morbius muttered. "It's not just a war, it's an ecological rewrite." He realized then that even if they won, the world would never be the same. The biology of the planet was being infected by the supernatural, and he was the only one who saw it as a pathogen. He reached the roof, pulling Integra up. Seras was there, manning her cannon, weeping as she watched the destruction. She looked at Morbius. "It's all ending, isn't it?" she asked. Morbius looked at the apocalypse. He adjusted his glasses, which were cracked and smeared with ash. "No," he said firmly. "Energy is neither created nor destroyed. It merely changes form. This isn't the end. It's a phase transition." He looked at the Zeppelin hovering above them. "And to stop the reaction," Morbius said, his eyes locking on the Major's airship, "we need to remove the catalyst." He pointed at the Deus Ex Machina. "I'm going up there." Integra looked at him. That is suicide. You cannot fly that high with the thermal updrafts. I am a bat, Morbius said, baring his fangs. I invented the updraft. He didn't wait. He leapt from the roof, spreading his wings, catching the heat of the burning monster of God below, and spiraling upward into the smoke, heading straight for the belly of the Nazi beast. The scientist leaving the ground, leaving the magic below to confront the man in the machine who had orchestrated the nightmare. Science versus the mad scientist. The final variable was in play. The ascent toward the Deus Ex Machina was a violation of aerodynamics and physiology. Michael Morbius rose on a column of superheated air, generated by the burning form of Alexander Anderson, the updraft so violent it threatened to strip the skin from his face. The smoke was a toxic slurry of burning London ozone and the vaporized holy relics of the Iscariot priest. Morbius kept his wings rigid, his hollow bones vibrating from the turbulence. He was ascending into the belly of a leviathan that hung in the sky like a second moon, casting a shadow of absolute tyranny over the ruins of the Hellsing estate. His objective was surgical. Remove the command structure. Neutralize the catalyst. But as he breached the cloud layer, the sheer scale of the Zeppelin became apparent. It was not a ship. It was a floating city of steel and hate. The external hull was bristling with flak cannons and V-1 launch tubes, but the defenses were pointed downward at the ground war. They did not expect a single biological entity to claw its way up from the inferno. Morbius banged sharply, aiming for a ventilation exhaust port near the aft engines. The heat coming from the port was intense enough to melt lead, but Morbius was already burning with the fever of the blood he had consumed. He folded his wings, diving into the exhaust stream. The sudden pressure change popped his eardrums, but they healed instantly. He grabbed the grating of the intake, tearing the metal apart with claws reinforced by the stolen strength of the Iscariot priest. He pulled himself inside, tumbling onto a metal walkway in the engineering deck. The air here was recycled cold and smelled of antiseptic and old blood. It was the smell of a hospital run by butchers. Morbius stood up, adjusting his shredded trench coat. His radar sense pinged the interior. It was a labyrinth of corridors, filled with the hum of machinery and the shuffling of feet. Not the rhythmic march of soldiers, but the erratic stumbling of the support staff. The ghouls, the technicians, the creatures that kept the war machine flying. Morbius moved. He did not run, he stalked. He adhered to the ceiling, utilizing the shadows between the harsh fluorescent lights. Below him, passed squads of Millennium Troopers, the last battalion rushing to their drop pods. They were ecstatic, eager to die. Morbius ignored them. He was hunting the brain, not the fingers. He followed the strongest signal of bioelectrical activity. It led him toward the bridge, but specifically to a subsection that smelled of formaldehyde and ozone. The laboratories. Morbius dropped down a maintenance shaft, landing in a sterile white corridor. The walls were lined with observation windows. He looked through the glass and stopped. His scientific detachment cracked. Inside the rooms were not soldiers but assembly lines. Human bodies were being processed like livestock. Tubes pumped the grey fluid into their veins. Electronics were grafted into their nervous systems. It was an industrialization of the curse. Morbius had spent his life trying to cure a blood disease using dangerous science, but he had done it to save lives. This was the inversion of his entire ethos. This was science used to manufacture death. A rage cold and sharp settled in his chest. He reached the heavy blast doors at the end of the hall. He didn't bother hacking the keypad. He punched the control panel, shattering the circuitry, and then ripped the doors open with a shriek of tearing metal. The room beyond was a massive command center dominated by banks of monitors and strange bubbling vats of green liquid. In the center sat a man in a blood-stained lab coat, adjusting a complex array of lenses on his face. The doctor, and behind him, protected by a wall of blast-proof glass, was the Major staring at the monitors with a look of rapturous delight. The Major did not turn. He was watching Alucard fight Anderson, but the doctor turned. He looked at Morbius with a mix of surprise and professional curiosity. He did not reach for a weapon. He reached for a notepad. "Remarkable," the doctor muttered, his voice trembling with excitement. "The subject delivers itself. No magical signature. Purely biological mutation. You must be the Morbius creature, the anomaly." Morbius walked forward, his claws dripping with the condensation of the cooling pipes. "I am not a creature," Morbius hissed. "I am a doctor, and I am revoking your license." The doctor giggled, a high-pitched sound that grated on Morbius's enhanced hearing. "A doctor? Oh no, my friend. You are a failure. You tried to cure yourself and made a monster. I embraced the monster and made an army. Who is the better scientist?" Morbius stopped 10 feet from the doctor. "You didn't make an army," Morbius said, gesturing to the vats. "You made puppets. You stripped them of their will. Evolution requires choice. This is just taxidermy." The doctor's smile faltered. "Efficiency is not taxidermy. We have optimized the vampire, removed the weakness to sunlight, removed the need for convoluted rituals. We reduced the myth to a formula. And you," the doctor tapped a key on his console, "you are just raw material." From the floor panels, 4 modified ghouls rose. These were not the standard infantry. These were chimeras. Massive, hulking things with multiple limbs and heavy machine guns grafted directly into their flesh. They opened fire instantly. Morbius moved. The room became a blur of violence. Morbius couldn't dodge the wall of lead, so he took it. The bullets tore through his flesh, but his regeneration, fueled by the priest's blood, was operating at peak efficiency. He healed around the bullets, spitting them out as he closed the distance. He slid under the first chimera, slicing its hamstrings. It collapsed, and Morbius drove his hand through its chest, ripping out the power core that animated it. It wasn't a heart, it was a battery. He threw the battery at the second chimera, the resulting explosion blinding the third. Morbius was a whirlwind of claws and physics. He used the momentum of the ghouls against them, fighting with a savage grace that terrified the doctor. Within 30 seconds, the creations were scrap metal and meat. Morbius stood amidst the carnage, panting steam rising from his wounds. He looked at the doctor. "Your hypothesis is flawed," Morbius said. "Complexity beats efficiency when the efficiency lacks a soul." He took a step toward the doctor, ready to end the madness. "Wait," the voice came from the speakers. The Major turned his chair around. He looked at Morbius through the glass. The Major was smiling. "Do not kill the doc just yet. He is vital for the finale. And you are fascinating. You talk of souls, yet you have none. You are a biological machine just like my soldiers. Why do you fight for the British, for the Hellsings? They are the old monsters. We are the new." Morbius looked at the fat little man who commanded this nightmare. "I don't fight for them," Morbius said. "I fight for the timeline. You are a cancer. You are trying to kill the host." The Major laughed. "The host is already dead. Look at the screens." Morbius looked. The monitors showed the battle below. Anderson was burning out. Alucard was regenerating. But something else was happening. The river of blood, the millions of souls Alucard had unleashed, was flowing back toward him. Alucard was preparing to drink the city to restore his power. "He is going to drink it all," the Major whispered, his voice ecstatic. "Every drop. And when he does, He will drink the poison. Poison? Morbius narrowed his eyes. He looked at the doctor, who was typing furiously on his console. On a separate screen, Morbius saw a live feed of the flight deck. A boy was sitting on the edge of the ramp, dangling his legs over the burning city. He wore a Hitler Youth uniform and had cat ears. Schrödinger. Morbius had seen him briefly in the files he stole. The warrant officer. The omnipresent boy. But looking at him now on the screen, Morbius's scientific mind saw something else. The boy wasn't stable. His image on the screen was flickering not due to signal interference, but due to existential interference. He is a quantum waveform, Morbius realized aloud. He exists in a state of superposition. He is everywhere and nowhere. The doctor nodded vigorously. Precisely. He is the observer and the observed. As long as he recognizes himself, he exists. But if he is absorbed, if he is diluted into the millions of minds inside Alucard, Morbius finished the sentence, the horror dawning on him. He will lose his self-recognition. He will become a variable that cannot be solved. Alucard will try to compute a paradox. He will crash. The Major clapped his hands. Bingo. The king of vampires will vanish. Not dead. Just gone. An equation that equals zero. It was a brilliant plan. A metaphysical assassination. But Morbius saw the flaw. He saw the cost. If Alucard vanished, the millions of souls he contained would not just disappear. Without the containment vessel of Alucard's ego, they would be released. Millions of hungry, confused, violent ghosts dumping into the atmosphere of London. It wouldn't just be the end of Alucard. It would be a spiritual nuclear winter. The psychic fallout would drive every living human in England insane. Morbius couldn't let that happen. He had to stop the boy from jumping, or he had to change the boy's nature. I won't let you, Morbius said. He lunged for the doctor, intending to smash the console that coordinated Schrödinger's movements. But the Major was faster, or rather, his defenses were. The glass wall didn't break. It was reinforced with the same alchemy that protected the Zeppelin. Morbius bounced off his shoulder, dislocating. He popped it back in. He turned to the door. He had to get to the flight deck. He had to intercept the boy. Stop him, the doctor shrieked. But Morbius was already gone, sprinting down the corridor. He moved faster than he had ever moved before, pushing his metabolism into the red zone. He burned the priest's blood, consuming the holy energy to fuel his muscles. He burst onto the flight deck. The wind was howling. The heat was unbearable. And there, sitting on the edge of the ramp, was Schrödinger. The boy looked up and smiled. "Hello, Mr. Doctor," Schrödinger said, his voice echoing as if spoken by 1,000 people at once. "You are late. The king is thirsty." Morbius stopped 5 yards from the boy. He could feel the radiation coming off him. It wasn't nuclear. It was probability radiation. The boy was a walking glitch in reality. "Don't jump," Morbius shouted over the wind. "You don't know what will happen. You won't just kill him. You'll shatter the biosphere." Schrödinger tilted his head. "I don't care. It's my purpose. I am the poison." He prepared to slide off the ramp. This was the moment. The small choice. Morbius could have pushed him. He could have tried to kill him. But Morbius was a doctor. He saw a child, even if it was a monster. And he saw a biological problem. If the boy was a waveform, he needed an anchor. He needed to be observed. But if Morbius introduced a foreign biological agent, something that defied the laws of this universe, he might be able to lock the boy's state, to make him solid so that he couldn't dissolve into Alucard. Morbius reached into his belt. He had one syringe left. It wasn't a weapon. It was a sample of his own blood mixed with the enzyme he had been developing to cure his condition. It was a mutagen, a retrovirus designed to rewrite DNA. If he injected Schrödinger, it might disrupt the quantum superposition. It might make the boy just a boy. It was a gamble, a scientific Hail Mary. Morbius lunged. "I'm sorry," Morbius whispered. He grabbed the boy's arm. Schrödinger looked surprised. "What are you to—" Morbius jammed the syringe into the boy's neck and depressed the plunger. The reaction was catastrophic. Schrödinger didn't turn into a normal boy. The Marvel Universe biology, the radioactive spider science, the mutant genes, the pseudo-vampirism, crashed into the Hellsing universe's quantum magic. The retrovirus tried to rewrite Schrödinger's DNA, but Schrödinger's DNA was imaginary. The conflict created a feedback loop. Schrödinger screamed. His body began to flicker violently, phasing in and out of existence. He turned blue, then red, then a void of black static. "It hurts," Schrödinger shrieked. "I don't know who I am. I am hunger." The virus had given the quantum ghost a biological imperative. The hunger of Morbius. Schrödinger bit Morbius's hand. Morbius roared, pulling back, but the connection was made. He felt his own life force being drained not into a stomach, but into a void. He kicked the boy away. Schrödinger stumbled back, clutching his throat. He looked at Morbius with eyes that were no longer human or cat-like, but swirling vortexes of red science and black magic. "I am still here," Schrödinger whispered. "But I am wrong." The Major's voice boomed over the deck speakers. "What have you done? The reading. His frequency is shifting. He is no longer zero. He is a variable." The Major sounded genuinely panicked for the first time. Morbius backed away, clutching his bleeding hand. "I anchored him," Morbius panted. "I gave him a biology. Now if Alucard drinks him, he won't disappear. He'll get sick. He'll just get food poisoning." Morbius thought he had saved the day. He thought he had neutralized the paradox. He was wrong. Schrödinger stumbled to the edge of the ramp. The retrovirus was mutating him rapidly. Bat-like wings began to tear out of his uniform. His smile widened, becoming a rictus of fangs. "I exist," Schrödinger laughed. "I exist so much now. I am hungry. And the king looks delicious." He didn't fall. He dove. But he didn't dive like a suicide victim. He dove like a predator. He aimed for the river of blood below. Morbius watched in horror. He hadn't stopped the poison. He had weaponized it. He had turned a passive tranquilizer into an aggressive virus. When Alucard drank this new Schrödinger, he wouldn't just vanish. He would be infected with a multiversal plague, a hunger that could consume the souls inside him. Morbius had just introduced the Morbius syndrome to a being composed of millions of lives. "You fool." The doctor stood at the doorway of the flight deck holding a massive remote control. "You didn't fix the equation. You changed the integers. Now the result will be undefined." The doctor pressed a button. The flight deck exploded. Not a bomb, but the structural supports were blown. The doctor was scuttling the section to get rid of Morbius. The metal groaned and sheared. Morbius lost his footing. The ramp detached, falling away from the Zeppelin. Morbius fell with it. He tumbled into the open sky, the burning city rushing up to meet him. He spread his wings, trying to catch the air, but the explosion had damaged his flight membrane. He was spiraling. As he fell, he looked down. He saw the tiny speck of Schrödinger hitting the sea of blood that surrounded Alucard. There was no splash. The blood accepted the boy. And then the blood stopped moving. It turned black. A ripple of necrosis spread outward from the impact point, moving faster than sound. The red river turned into a black sludge. The souls inside began to scream, not in fear, but in hunger. Alucard, who was standing in the center of the absorption, froze. He clutched his chest. The eyes on his body opened wide, rolling back. The absorption accelerated, but it was violent now. Alucard wasn't drinking the blood. The blood was invading him. Morbius saw the king of vampires drop to his knees, vomiting a torrent of black corruption. The Major's plan had failed, but Morbius's intervention had created something worse. Alucard was not fading away. He was mutating. He was becoming a living vampire on a cosmic scale. Morbius crashed into the roof of a clock tower miles below, smashing through the slate and timber. He landed in the gear room, his body broken, his energy spent. He lay there in the dust, listening to the sound of the world changing. The scream of Alucard echoed across the city, a sound that shattered windows and cracked the pavement. It was the sound of an immune system failing. Morbius closed his eyes. He had tried to be a doctor. He had tried to use science to solve a magic problem, and in doing so, he had proven the oldest rule of his life. The cure is often worse than the disease. He heard the gears of the clock tower grinding above him. Time was marching on, but it was marching toward a future that no longer matched the history books. Morbius dragged himself into the corner. He needed to heal. He needed to think, because when Alucard stood up again, he wouldn't be the servant of the Hellsing family. He would be a patient zero of a plague that spanned 2 universes, and Morbius was the only one who knew the antidote, if there even was one. High above, the Deus Ex Machina began to tilt. The internal explosion set off by the doctor to purge Morbius had triggered a chain reaction. The Zeppelin was dying. Burning debris rained down like meteors. But Morbius didn't look up. He looked at his hand, where Schrödinger had bitten him. The wound wasn't healing. It was shimmering, phasing in and out. Morbius realized with a jolt of terror that the transfer hadn't been one way. He had given Schrödinger biology, but Schrödinger had given him uncertainty. Morbius looked at his hand, and for a second it wasn't there. Then it was. He was becoming unstable. He was becoming part of the equation. "I need a lab," Morbius whispered to the darkness. "I need to isolate the variable." He stood up, shaking, ignoring the pain. The choice had been made. The multiverse had not just collided, it had cross-contaminated, and the result was rising from the streets of London, hungry for everything. Morbius limped to the window of the clock tower. He saw Ceres Victoria flying toward the city centre, her face a mask of terror. She felt it too, the change in her master. Morbius wanted to call out to warn her, but he knew she wouldn't listen. To her, he was the man who had been on the Zeppelin, the accomplice. He was alone, truly alone. He checked his pockets. He still had the notepad he had swiped from the doctor's lab in the chaos. He hadn't destroyed the research. He had stolen it. He opened the blood-stained pages. Project Mina. Artificial soul integration. He scanned the formulas. Maybe, just maybe, if he could synthesize a soul, if he could create a decoy, he could pull the poison out of Alucard. But he needed time. And time was the one thing the Major had just run out of. The Zeppelin groaned and began its final death dive, aimed straight for the centre of London. Aimed at Alucard. The stage was set for the final convergence. Morbius closed the notebook. He wouldn't run. He would operate. He was the surgeon of the apocalypse, and the patient was the world itself. He stepped out of the clock tower, not gliding this time, but falling with style, letting gravity take him back into the slaughter. This ended not with a bang, but with a mutation. The story had shifted from a war story to a medical horror, and the prognosis was terminal. The impact of the Deus Ex Machina upon the ruins of London was less a collision and more an extinction event localized to the city of Westminster. The burning Zeppelin struck the earth with the weight of a dying ideology, its steel skeleton buckling and screaming as it ploughed through the wreckage of the Hellsing manor and the surrounding districts. The shockwave was visible, a rapidly expanding dome of dust and fire that flattened the remaining structures and atomized the blood-soaked streets. Michael Morbius watched the destruction from the relative safety of the shattered clock tower, but he felt the impact in his teeth and in the shimmering instability of his own molecular structure. The bite from Schrödinger was spreading a numbness up his arm, a sensation of being erased and rewritten simultaneously. He was flickering. One moment he was solid mass. The next he was a transparency of probability. He realized with the cold detachment of a diagnostician that he was becoming a dimensional anchor for the chaos unfolding below. The crash of the airship did not kill Alucard. Nothing could kill Alucard now. The explosion merely served as a catalyst for the metamorphosis. From the burning crater where the Zeppelin had entombed the vampire king, a column of black sludge erupted, reaching for the stratosphere. It was the blood river, but it had gone septic. The millions of souls Alucard had consumed were now infected with the hunger Morbius had introduced via Schrödinger. They were no longer passive batteries of life force. They were active parasitic consumers. The black pillar writhed, twisting into shapes that defied Euclidean geometry, mouths widening into eyes, limbs ending in voids. The sound that emanated from it was not a roar, but a broadcast, a psychic scream of a million minds suddenly starving at once. Morbius clutched his phasing arm. He had to move. He had to close the case. He leaped from the clock tower. Gravity briefly forgot him, and he fell like a feather before slamming into the pavement with his full weight. The laws of physics were breaking down locally. He ran toward the crash site, his boots splashing through the rising tide of black necrotic fluid. The fluid hissed where it touched his trench coat, eating the fabric. This was not just blood. It was anti-life. It was the physical manifestation of a paradox. As he ran, he saw the remnants of the battle. The Vatican helicopters were falling from the sky, their rotors clogged with the thick airborne miasma. The surviving Iscariot troops were drowning in the sludge, their prayers silenced by the suffocating weight of the corrupted souls. Morbius ignored them. Triage was impossible. This was surgery or death. He reached the edge of the crater. The heat was intense, burning the oxygen out of the air. In the center of the inferno stood the Deus Ex Machina, broken in half like a titanic egg. And rising from the wreckage was the entity that used to be Alucard. It was a mountain of flesh and shadow, a hydra of black blood. In the center of the mass, trapped in a cage of solidified darkness, was the human form of Alucard. He was thrashing his mouth open in a silent scream, his eyes wide with a terror that a creature of his age should not be capable of feeling. He was not in control. He was the host of a cancer that was eating the universe. Morbius scanned the chaotic battlefield for a way in. He saw a flash of yellow. Ceres Victoria. The fledgling vampire was clinging to a piece of wreckage near the epicenter, her shadow arm acting as a shield against the lashing tendrils of the black blood. She was trying to reach her master, but the corruption was repelling her. Every time she got close, the sludge reacted violently, forming spears and walls to push her back. She was crying, screaming Alucard's name. Morbius sprinted toward her, dodging a whip of black blood that pulverized a tank next to him. He slid across the metal plating of the fallen Zeppelin, coming to a stop beside her. Sarah spun around, her cannon raised, but lowered it when she saw the scientist. Her eyes were red, rimmed with desperation. "What did you do?" she screamed at him. "What did you give him?" Morbius grabbed her shoulder. his hand briefly phasing through her uniform before solidifying. "I gave him a variable he couldn't solve," Morbius shouted over the roar of the monster. "I tried to lock the boy's state, but the interaction, it inverted the absorption. Alucard isn't drinking the souls anymore. They are drinking him. It's an autoimmune collapse on a metaphysical scale." Sarah stared at him, not understanding the science, but understanding the horror. "Fix it," she demanded, grabbing his lapels. "You broke him. You fix him." "I intend to," Morbius said, pulling away. "But I need a path. That black matter, it reacts to biological intent. It's a predator. If I try to walk through it, will eat me. But you," he looked at Sarah's, "you are a true vampire. You are part of his lineage. You share his blood. If you resonate with him, if you call to him, the blood might hesitate. It might recognize you as self." Ceres looked at the writhed mountain of corruption. She was terrified. She was a police girl who had seen too much, but she nodded. She turned to the monster and closed her eyes. She reached out not with her hands but with her blood. She projected her bond, her loyalty, her soul toward the thing in the center. The reaction was immediate. The lashing tendrils slowed. The screaming voices softened. The black blood parted slightly, creating a narrow, treacherous corridor leading to the central mass. "It's working," Saras whispered, sweating with the effort. "Go. I can't hold it for long." Morbius didn't hesitate. He engaged his thrusters, his muscles firing with the explosive power of the Iscariot blood he still held in reserve. He sprinted into the corridor of death. The walls of black sludge towered over him, pulsating with faces that moaned and gnashed their teeth. He saw Turkish janissaries. He saw Wallachian peasants. He saw World War II soldiers. All of them looked at him with the hunger of the Morbius virus. He ran faster. The corridor began to close. Ceras's influence was waning against the sheer volume of the corruption. A hand made of sludge grabbed Morbius's ankle. He didn't stop. He fired a point-blank sonic blast from his mouth, shattering the arm into droplets of ink. He scrambled up the incline of the wreckage, his claws digging into the burning steel. He was 20 yards from Alucard. 10 yards. He could see the king clearly now. Alucard was fused to the ship. His red coat tattered his skin grey and cracking, and inside Alucard's chest, pulsing with a sickening blue light, was the anomaly. Schrödinger. The boy was not dead. He was embedded in Alucard's heart, a tumor of quantum uncertainty. But Morbius was not the only one who had survived the crash. A grey blur intercepted him. The captain. The werewolf of Millennium had pulled himself from the rubble. He was burned, his uniform gone, his fur scorched, but he was alive. And he was still on mission. He stood between Morbius and Alucard. He didn't transform into the wolf. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, a silent monolith of duty. The captain looked at Alucard, then at Morbius. He saw the corruption. He saw that his side had lost. The Major's plan had failed. But the captain was a soldier. He had orders to kill the intruders. He raised his fists. Morbius skidded to a halt. He didn't have time for this. "Move," Morbius growled, his eyes glowing red. "The war is over. Look at him. There is no winner here. If I don't extract the boy, the planet dies." The captain tilted his head. He looked at the screaming Alucard. For the first time, Morbius saw an emotion in the werewolf's eyes. It was pity. The captain looked back at Morbius. He lowered his fists. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver object, a lighter. He flicked it open, lighting the flame. He looked at the black sludge encroaching on them. The captain pointed at Alucard, then at Morbius. A silent gesture. "Finish it." Then the captain turned and walked directly into the wall of black blood. He didn't fight it. He let it take him. He sacrificed himself to buy Morbius the final second. The sludge swarmed the werewolf, consuming the last true soldier of millennium. The path remained open for one more heartbeat. Morbius lunged. He tackled Alucard. The contact was electric. Morbius didn't just touch a body. He touched a dimension. He was pulled inside. The world of burning London vanished, replaced by a red ocean of blood. But the ocean was boiling. The sky was black static. Morbius stood on the surface of the blood sea. In front of him, suspended in the air, was Schrödinger. The boy was crying, clutching his head, his cat ears twitching violently. He was flickering rapidly. Boy, skeleton, wave, particle. "I can't stop eating," Schrödinger wailed, his voice distorting. "I am everywhere, and I am hungry everywhere." Morbius walked across the blood. "Schrödinger," he shouted, "listen to me. You are a waveform. You need an observer to collapse the function. Look at me." The boy looked. His eyes were voids. "I see you," Schrödinger whispered. "You are the bat. You are the sickness." "I am the cure," Morbius corrected. He grabbed the boy. He didn't use a syringe this time. He used his own unstable biology. Morbius was phasing due to the bite. He was currently existing in two states, Marvel physics and Hellsing magic. He acted as a bridge. He channeled the hunger, the drive to consume that defined his existence, and he pulled it out of the boy. He reversed the polarity of the virus. Instead of the boy infecting Alucard with hunger, Morbius absorbed the hunger back into himself. It was agonizing. It felt like drinking the sun. The Morbius syndrome he had created rushed back into his own veins, amplified by the millions of souls it had touched. Morbius screamed, his back arching his trench coat, shredding as his body began to mutate. He grew larger. His skin turned obsidian. His wings spanned the horizon of the mindscape. He was becoming the vessel for the collective starvation of the Hellsing universe. "You are collapsing the wave," Schrödinger shouted, his form stabilizing. "You are taking the variable." "I am the control group," Morbius roared. With a final effort of will, he ripped the quantum uncertainty out of Alucard's core. He separated the boy from the king. The connection shattered. Morbius was ejected from the mindscape. He flew backward, landing hard on the steel of the Zeppelin wreckage. He gasped, air rushing into his lungs. The black tower of sludge began to collapse. Deprived of the paradox, the souls lost their aggressive coherence. They turned back into liquid. The pillar fell, raining dead blood over the ruins. In the center of the puddle, Alucard fell to his knees. He vomited a massive torrent of blue fluid, the essence of Schrödinger, and then collapsed, his body smoking as it began to knit itself back together. The crisis was contained. The paradox was solved. But the cost was standing on the hull of the ship. Morbius stood up. But he wasn't Michael Morbius anymore. Not entirely. He was 10 feet tall. His skin was a dark grey carapace. His eyes were no longer red, but a swirling mix of blue and violet, the color of the bruised sky. He radiated a power that made the air hum. He had absorbed the residual energy of the paradox. He had eaten the hunger. He looked at his hands. They were claws that could cut through reality. He felt the thirst. It wasn't for blood. It was for energy, for existence. He had become a living black hole. He looked at Alucard, who was slowly recovering. He looked at Seras, who was watching him with fear. He realized that he was now the biggest threat in the room. If he stayed, he would consume them. He would eat this world. "Doctor?" Seras whispered. Morbius looked at her. His voice was a grinding tectonic rumble. "The hunger. It is infinite." He took a step back. "I cannot stay." He looked up at the sky. The clouds were parting, revealing the stars. But the stars looked delicious. He had to leave. He had to exile himself before he fared on the earth. But before he could launch himself into the void, a voice stopped him. "So, you are the winner." Morbius looked down. Lying in the wreckage, half crushed by a steel beam, was the Major. The leader of Millennium was dying. His cybernetic body was sparking, his fluids leaking. But he was smiling. He looked at the monstrous form of Morbius. "I wanted to defeat Alucard," the Major wheezed. "I wanted to prove that man could defeat monster. But in the end, a monster defeated a monster using science. It is acceptable." The Major coughed oil and blood. "You are a magnificent war doctor. You are the conflict I dreamed of." Morbius looked at the dying madman. The scientist in him, the human part that still existed deep inside the carapace, felt a surge of pity. "You didn't want war," Morbius rumbled. "You wanted meaning. You were afraid of being forgotten." The Major laughed a weak, sputtering sound. "Perhaps. But look, he is still alive." The Major pointed a shaking finger at Alucard. "I failed. He exists." "He exists," Morbius agreed. "But he knows fear now. You gave him that." Morbius turned away. He crouched, his powerful legs compressing the steel plates beneath him. He prepared to jump not to the next rooftop, but to the upper atmosphere. He needed to get away from the biomass. He needed the cold of space to slow his metabolism. Wait! It was Integra Hellsing. She had climbed out of the rubble of the manor, bruised, bleeding, her sword broken, but her spirit intact. She stood on the edge of the crater, looking up at the monster Morbius had become. "You are not leaving this planet," she ordered, her voice cracking but authoritative. "You are a loose end. You are a variable. We deal with our messes." Morbius looked down at the woman. "I am not your mess, Sir Integra. I am a side effect." He paused. "Your vampire is cured. The boy is gone, dispersed into the probability stream. The Nazis are dead. My work is done." "And what about you?" Integra shouted. "Where will you go? There is no cure for what you are now." Morbius smiled a terrifying expression of fangs and sorrow. "There is no cure for being alive, Integra. There is only management." He looked at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to rise. The rays of dawn hit him. In his old form, the sun would have weakened him. But this new form, the sun felt like a light snack. He absorbed the radiation, his skin glowing. He was solar-powered now, a fusion reactor with a heartbeat. "I will find a place," Morbius said, "where the hunger does not hurt anyone. Until then, try not to make any more monsters." With a sonic boom that shattered the remaining windows in London, Morbius launched himself into the sky. He ascended faster than a jet, breaking the sound barrier in seconds. He climbed until the air grew thin, until the sky turned black. He reached the edge of the atmosphere. He looked down at the earth. It was beautiful, glowing with life, and he wanted to eat it all. The struggle was not over. It had just changed venues. He turned his back on the world and drifted toward the dark side of the moon. He would wait there. He would study his new condition. He was the living vampire who had tasted the blood of a quantum ghost and the soul of a king. He was the lonely god of the lunar orbit. Below, on the surface, the silence returned to London. The black sludge began to dry, turning into a brittle ash that blew away in the wind. Alucard sat up. He was whole again, but he was different. His eyes were not red. They were heterochromatic, one red, one blue, a permanent scar of the fusion. He looked at the sky where Morbius had vanished. He touched his chest. He felt lighter. Millions of souls were gone, burned up in the extraction. He was no longer a legion. He was just Alucard, a vampire, not a god, not a river, just a man who couldn't die. He laughed softly. It wasn't a maniacal laugh. It was a tired laugh. Science, Alucard murmured. What a troublesome magic. Integra walked down into the crater. Ceres joined her, supporting her master. The three of them stood amidst the ruins of their life's work. The Millennium Organization was dust. The Vatican was in retreat. The city was a graveyard, but they were alive. Integra took a cigar from her pocket. It was crushed, but she lit it anyway. She took a deep drag and exhaled smoke into the dawn. Report, she said simply. Alucard stood up, dusting off his coat. The threat is neutralized, Master. The Major is dead. The anomaly has departed. And the cost? Integra asked, looking at the devastation. Alucard looked at his hand. He flexed his fingers. I am finite, he said. I can feel the edges of my soul. He took the excess. He pruned the garden. Alucard smiled a genuine smile. I believe I am mortal again, or close enough to make it interesting. Ceres looked at the moon visible in the morning sky. Will he come back? She asked. The doctor? Integra adjusted her glasses. He is a man of science, Ceres. Science always returns to the scene of the experiment. She turned and began walking out of the crater toward the rising sun. But next time, we will be the ones asking the questions. Come, we have a lot of paperwork to do. They walked away, leaving the ruins of the Deus Ex Machina to rust. The story of the Hellsing organization continued, but the timeline had shifted. The existence of the supernatural was now undeniable. The scar on London was too big to hide. The world would have to adapt. Science and magic had collided, and neither had won. They had just created a new, more complicated reality. And watching from the dark side of the moon, Michael Morbius opened his notebook. He had a lot of data to process, and an eternity to do it. The crossover was complete. The catastrophe was documented. The timeline was locked. The reconstruction of London was not merely a matter of masonry and steel, but a complex exorcism of the soil itself. In the years following the Millennium incident, the city was rebuilt on the top of a geological layer officially classified by the British government as the Ash Horizon. This stratum, composed of the calcified remains of the River of Death and the blackened residue of the Deus Ex Machina, possessed faint radioactive properties that baffled physicists and terrified theologians. It was a permanent physical record of the night where science and magic had engaged in mutual assured destruction. Sir Integra Fairbrook Wingates sat in her office overlooking the new skyline. She was older now. The grey in her hair more pronounced her eye patch, a permanent testament to the war. On her desk sat a dossier stamped with the seals of the United Nations Security Council and the newly formed Bureau for Paranormal Defense. The file was titled Project Lunacy. It contained high-resolution telescopic imagery taken from the Hubble Space Telescope focused on the dark side of the moon. The images were grainy, but the silhouette was unmistakable. A figure sat on the rim of the Shackleton crater. It was motionless, frozen in the vacuum, a sentinel carved from living obsidian. It did not need air. It did not need heat. It fed on the cosmic background radiation and the light of the sun. Michael Morbius had kept his word. He had exiled himself to the only prison capable of holding his hunger. But his presence there had changed the geopolitical landscape. The superpowers of the world no longer looked at each other with suspicion, they looked up. The space race had reignited not for exploration, but for defense. Humanity knew there was a god sleeping on their moon, and they knew he was a scientist. The door to the office creaked open. Alucard entered carrying a silver tray with tea. He moved differently now. The shifting, chaotic shadows that used to trail behind him were gone. He walked with the solid, heavy step of a man. His powers were still formidable, but they were finite. He was no longer a legion of millions. He was one vampire with one life to lose. He placed the tea on the desk and looked at the photograph of the moon. A small smirk played on his lips. He did not hate the creature in the sky. In a way, he missed him. Morbius was the only being who had ever truly understood the anatomy of his curse. "He is active," Alucard said, his voice smooth and devoid of the madness of the past. "I can feel him when the tide changes. He is dreaming." Indigra picked up the tea. "Let him dream," she replied, taking a sip. "As long as he stays up there, we are safe down here. But we must be ready. Science evolves Alucard. Eventually, he will finish his calculations. And when he comes back down, he will expect us to have done our homework." Alucard walked to the window, looking up at the pale disk in the afternoon sky. The world had become a larger, more frightening place. The existence of the multiverse was no longer a theory, it was a threat assessment. The timeline had been cauterized, but the wound remained. "Let him come," Alucard whispered, his single human eye gleaming. "We have evolved too. We are no longer monsters and men. We are the survivors." The story of the collision was over, but the history of the new world had just begun. High above in the silence of space, the living vampire opened his eyes and the red glow was visible from Earth, a new star in the firmament. Watching, waiting, and forever hungry,